Don't forget to pick up all attendees and panelists. We'll get started. It's a little bit early yet, but we will get started shortly. You've come to the right place. The Modern Slavery Act, Key Compliance Trends and Next Steps. Terrific. Great, welcome Dave and Michael. Fantastic to have you join. Anyone else tell us where you're from? Is it sunny Melbourne, sunny Auckland, or further afield? Malibu, welcome Marcia. And Sydney. Ashley from Western Australia, welcome. People from Adelaide. We will get started shortly. Settle back, relax. Hope you've got a cup of tea and some lunch. Or if you're in New Zealand, perhaps not lunch. If you're further afield, it might be a midnight snack. Great to have everybody joining us for this is our last CIPS webinar for the year. Welcome everybody. Keep telling us where you're from. Got people from Port Macquarie. Few people from Port Macquarie. Newcastle. Don't forget to choose all panelists and attendees as well to let everybody who's joining us know where you're calling from or Zooming from. We will shortly be getting started. The webinar, Modern Slavery Act, Key Compliance Trends and Next Steps. Just waiting for everybody to join us. Central Coast, welcome Jane. So welcome everyone. You've reached the CIPS ANZ webinar entitled Modern Slavery Act, Key Compliance Trends and the Next Steps. Welcome to everyone, to those watching live on YouTube and those registered participants. We're delighted that you can join us for this valuable session on modern slavery. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. They're the traditional custodians of the land on which I present today, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples today. Tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou, tēnā koukou katoa to our New Zealand friends. We have close to 300 people registered today, and this is our final CIPS webinar for 2020, and we're really pleased to be able to end our webinar series with this important topic that lies at the heart of CIPS values, ethos and belief. For those of you who don't know us, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or better known as CIPS, is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals. And at CIPS, we believe people, profit and planet are imperative issues for the public, for our consumers, for our shareholders and our employers. Our ethics training is mandatory for those with MCIPS chartered status. We believe any organisation behaving ethically is about reputation, and it just makes good business sense. Suppliers will want to work with you, and you will attract the right talent to work with you. Everyone working in our profession needs to be aware of the risks in supply chain, how to recognise them and how to mitigate them. And modern slavery is one of those major risks that we all need to be aware of. We're delighted to be joined by some real specialists in this topic, and there'll be plenty of opportunity after today's presentation for you to ask questions, so do get prepared for that. A bit of Zoom keeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees, and it will also go up on the CIPS dedicated YouTube channel next week. All of you have been muted. Sorry about that. There's many of you there. However, please keep using the chat box to tell us where you're from or if you've got any comments to make. But just a reminder to pick up all panelists and all attendees so everyone can see your comments. As mentioned, if you've got any specific questions, we will address them directly after with our panelists. So just enter them in the Q&A box, which is just to the left side of the chat box. Now, without any further ado, please allow me to introduce you to Nicholas Bernhard, our CEO of Informed 365. Welcome, Nicholas. Great to have you on board.
Thanks, Sharon. Absolutely delighted to be here, and good to hear that we've got a lot of people calling in from all over the world. What I'd like to do first is I'd like to just provide a bit of context as to why we're actually even here at this webinar. Modern slavery has been around for a very, very long time, and humanity has not been that great at dealing with this issue. Quite frankly, it's actually got worse over time. And to sort of amplify that, currently there are 40 million people trapped in some form of slavery on this planet. And I'll come back to that number in a second. But just to put that in context, that's 1 in 200 people. 71% of those 40 million are female. So very, very critical that we start addressing this issue. But 40 million is sort of a bit of a number. 40 million doesn't mean much. Let me introduce you to James from Lake Volta in Ghana. He was sold by his dad at the age of 6. He was trafficked with 5 other boys. 3 of them lived, 3 died. He worked 17 hours a day, had no medical care, was sometimes fed, but literally only fed once a day. And at the age of 13, he escaped. And now he's dedicated his life to helping people that are in similar situations to him. Another sobering sort of stat is that less than 1% of victims are identified and freed. I mentioned the 40 million. The 40 million mark is something that is a number, because there's no statistics out there. There's no sort of GDP. This is what the number looks like. In the UK, in July of this year, there was an upward revision from 10,000 to 100,000 victims of slavery. So that's an increase of 10. So 10 times the number that was suspected in the UK. And this was after an incident in Leicester at a factory that delivered or provided goods to Boohoo as a fast fashion retailer. One other thing that I want to do before I really hand over to the key aspects of this meeting, and that's the Australian Border Forces, just wanted to share some of the key learnings we've had with Informed 365, dealing with corporates. And these are just some of the key aspects. So transparency is the key. It's not perfection. No one's going to get this right immediately. It is the time to sort of start sending clear signals to your supply chain. You need to be committed to change as well. And probably the most important one of all of these is collaboration. I might just quickly delve into that for another 20 seconds or so before I do hand over to the Border Force guys. This is one of the areas where I'm very passionate about. This is where real change can come about. The Property Council of Australia, where in an Australian first, they decided to collaborate on this front. And that's the likes of Stocklands, Mirvac, Lendlease, Frasers, GPT. Too many to mention, but they said, let's tackle this problem as a consortium rather than all of us in isolation. And we've already seen some really massive benefits around that, efficiencies. supplier education, there's consistency. Suppliers know what they need to do. There's data sharing, there's impartiality, because every single entity of these of this consortium can analyze and carry out their own sort of next steps based on the data. And probably last but not least, there's a greater impact because it's an industry voice. But now, without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted that we've got the Australian Border Force team here, or some of the team members here. First of all, I'd love to introduce you to Eleanor Palo, who works in the Business and Government Engagement section in the Australian Border Force's dedicated modern slavery and human trafficking branch. That's quite a tongue twister. I'm happy it's not Friday today. She has led the development of the Australian government's first Commonwealth Modern Slavery Statement, which will be released in a few weeks' time. And she's also delivered briefings and presentations to key Commonwealth government agencies on modern slavery risks in public sector procurement. Now, if that wasn't enough, we've also got Alex Coward. Alex Coward has been working this space for many a year. He also works with Ellie, and he has led the government's work to develop and implement the Modern Slavery Act, and has over these years worked on many projects for the government, and he has also delivered training to foreign governments and represented Australia at the United Nations around modern slavery issues. So without further ado, over to the Australian Border Force.
Hi everyone, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Thanks, Nicholas, for the introduction. As Nicholas said, I have been working in the Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking branch to develop the Australian Government's first Commonwealth Statement. So today I can speak from first-hand experience in what probably many of you are experiencing right now in developing your modern slavery statement. So I keenly understand some of the challenges and difficulties with developing a modern slavery statement. So today I'll talk to you about, I'll start by outlining some of the key features of the Modern Slavery Act. Then I'll talk through our approach to publishing the modern slavery statements that we receive. And then I'll finish by concluding with talking about some of the good practice trends that we're seeing with the statements that have been submitted, and also some areas for improvement. Oh, sorry, the presentation's just frozen. So the aim of our Modern Slavery Act is to combat modern slavery in global supply chains by improving supply chain transparency. So the Act applies to all entities that operate in the Australian market that have an annual consolidated revenue of $100 million or more. So we're expecting that this will apply to approximately 3,000 entities. So entities who meet that revenue threshold must publish annual modern slavery statements for every financial year of the entity. Statements must explain the reporting entity's actions to assess and address modern slavery risks in their global operations and supply chains, and those of their subsidiaries. And the modern slavery statements must address 7 mandatory criteria that are set out in the Act, and I'll go through these criteria in a bit more detail shortly. So importantly, all modern slavery statements must be approved at board level and signed by a member of the board. Multiple reporting entities can report jointly if they wish, and smaller entities can also voluntarily opt in to report. So if your entity is required to report under the Modern Slavery Act and meets that revenue threshold, you'll need to prepare a modern slavery statement that addresses the 7 mandatory criteria that are set out in the Act. So the aim of these criteria is to ensure that the content of statements is consistent and comparable amongst all the statements. So the first tranche of statements that we'll go into a bit further shortly suggest that some reporting entities and their advisors aren't referring back to these criteria when they're developing their statements, and we'll talk through some of these the issues a bit further. So in summary, the 7 mandatory criteria require your entity to explain how your entity works, where your general areas of modern slavery risks may lie, and what you're doing about these risks. This includes a description of the risks and any actions taken by your reporting entity. as well as any entities that your entity owns or controls. So we've published, earlier we published some online guidance, which is available on both the Modern Slavery Register and our Home Affairs Modern Slavery website, which provides some step-by-step guidance for all reporting entities on how to develop your modern slavery statement and address these criteria. So now I'll talk through our approach to publication of the statements that we receive. So the deadline for the first modern slavery statements to be submitted to our team in the ABF is between December of this year and June 2021, depending on the reporting period for your business. You can find some more detailed information about the various reporting deadlines and how that may apply to your entity on our website. Once statements are submitted to us through our online register, we will make these statements publicly available in regular tranches. We expect that submission rates will peak around March next year, when the deadline for Australian reporting entities is. So to maximise transparency and ensure that entities are publicly accountable for their actions to combat modern slavery, we're going to publish all statements that are provided to us, so long as the statements are properly approved by the principal governing body and have been signed by a member of that body. So this approach to publication means that the public, investors and other businesses are able to view and compare all statements, and entities that submit poor quality statements will be publicly identifiable. We will not publish any statements that are not approved by the principal governing body or signed by the responsible member, and we will return these statements to those entities to amend those errors. So our approach to publication means that the publication of a statement on the register doesn't necessarily mean that it is compliant with the Act and addresses all of the mandatory criteria. And we've updated our online modern slavery register to reflect that. We'll also be providing some non-binding confidential feedback to selected reporting entities about the quality of their statements and how to improve these. We hope that this feedback process will support entities reporting for the first time to address some of the possible compliance errors and build our own team's understanding of some of the key barriers and difficulties with compliance. In addition to this selected feedback, we'll also be releasing regular public updates on key reporting trends. So we hope that this will help reporting entities to understand and respond to some of the key issues in a timely manner. We've also released 2 guidance notes that went public with the first tranche of statements on the register. One of these guidance notes reports on general reporting trends that we're seeing, and the other provides examples of how entities can go about describing the consultation process. And this is one of the mandatory criteria that we've seen some of the most problems with, and many entities have omitted in their modern slavery statements that they've submitted. Moving on to talk a little bit about the first tranche of statements. This, you may have seen, went live on our online register last Friday. And so our online register is the first government-run register of its kind in the world. Statements that are published on the register will be fully searchable by keywords. And you can also refine the searches in the register by selecting specific industry categories, revenue levels, countries where entities are headquartered, and by searching whether entities are covered by similar laws overseas. The first statements that were published on Friday are early statements and have been submitted ahead of the legislative deadlines for reporting. These statements covered entities with over $50 billion in combined revenue and were from 11 different countries. A significant proportion of these statements are from very large entities with over $1 billion in revenue, and most of the statements that we've received so far have been from Australian entities. Many of the statements in the first tranche are from the finance, IT, and extractives industries, which may reflect the high levels of awareness of modern slavery issues and other ESG risks in these sectors. So I'll just finish by talking through some of the good practice trends and some of the areas for improvement that we've found from this first tranche of statements. So we're closely monitoring the quality of all the statements that are submitted to us. And based on this first tranche, we've identified a range of good practice trends. So these include statements that clearly address the mandatory criteria. So while there's no set structure for how an entity must set out their modern slavery statement, We are seeing a direct correlation between the quality of modern slavery statements and their structure. The highest quality statements that we're seeing have clearly set out with headings and sections that directly relate to each of the 7 mandatory criteria, or they might use an illustrative table at the beginning of the statement to explain how each of the sections correspond to the mandatory criteria. The second good practice trend that we're seeing are statements that address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we know that COVID-19 has impacted every business and has significantly increased modern slavery risks for vulnerable workers in supply chains. COVID has also impacted how we can monitor and investigate our supply chains and engage with our suppliers. So the high quality statements that we're seeing have recognised these impacts, have sought to identify where modern slavery risks may have increased as a result of COVID-19, and have sought to clearly explain some of the actions that they are taking to respond to these increased risks. Another good practice trend that we're seeing has been the inclusion of case studies in statements. So we've seen high quality statements use these case studies to present examples that demonstrate in practical terms how the reporting entity is acting to combat modern slavery. These case studies help show that the entity is translating its commitment to combating modern slavery into concrete on-the-ground change. And the final good practice trend that we've seen are statements that set out a plan for future action. So we're seeing the higher quality statements set out a plan for continuous improvement, which show how the reporting entity plans to strengthen its response each year. So the flip side of that is where we've identified some common areas for improvement in the statements that we've received so far. The first area for improvement is statements failing to show that they have principal governing body approval or that the statement has been signed by a responsible member of that body. So statements must indicate that they've been approved by the reporting entity's principal governing bodies. For companies, this is the board, and they must also be signed by a responsible member of the entity. So for companies, this would be the director. A similar area for improvement that we're seeing is that entities are failing to identify the reporting entity covered by the statement. So the Act requires statements to clearly identify the Australian reporting entity and the business required to report. For example, a statement from a large overseas corporate group must identify which of the Australian subsidiaries in the group are reporting entities and covered by the statement. A third area for improvement that we're seeing is entities, particularly foreign entities, who have attempted to reuse statements created to comply with overseas reporting requirements, for example, under the UK Modern Slavery Act or the California Act. These other jurisdictions' laws don't have the same mandatory criteria for content as the Australian Act. So generally, the statements prepared under those acts are not compliant with the mandatory criteria in our acts. So if your business has previously reported under an overseas law, it's important that you amend your statement to ensure that it meets all the requirements of the Australian Act. Finally, as I flagged a bit earlier, another common area for improvement that we're seeing is that some statements are failing to include any information about how they consulted with the entities that they own or control in the preparation of the modern slavery statement. If your business has subsidiaries, you need to explain this in your statement and outline how you engaged with these subsidiaries to prepare the statement. And there's a guidance note on our register that provides examples of how you might go about doing this in your statement. So finally, moving forward, it's important that entities reporting under the Act consider how they can refine their responses over the next reporting period. One key area for improvement is ensuring that your statements do not include technical compliance issues, such as failing to describe consultation or clearly demonstrating that you've received board approval. Statements must address all criteria in the Act, including these requirements. Secondly, we'll be looking to see the entities increase the sophistication of their responses. For many entities, the first statement is about creating the foundation for further action, and this has certainly been the flavour of the government's own first statement. So we encourage you to consider how you can demonstrate continuous improvement. For example, you might begin engaging with suppliers beyond Tier 1 level, or develop a more detailed plan for remediating modern slavery cases. Finally, it's important that entities explore opportunities for collaboration to share expertise and identify opportunities for shared action. This may be with your business peers, industry bodies, or civil society. So that's the end of our presentation today, and I think we'll be moving into the Q&A session right now. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand back.
Thank you, Ali. And if Alex and Nicholas can join us, and don't forget, folks, there's plenty of time to answer some questions and put it in the Q&A box. So I might direct this to the Voltaforce team. What are some of the common mistakes you are seeing in early statements?
Thanks, Sharon. So in addition to some of the issues that I just covered in our presentation, one key error that we're seeing reporting entities make is focusing on modern slavery risks in their supply chains and neglecting to focus on the modern slavery risks in their operations. So the Act requires entities to report on their actions to address modern slavery risks in both their global operations and supply chains. And some entities may have significant modern slavery risks in their operations, including those sectors such as construction, extractives, and agriculture. And it's important that entities consider these risks and their actions to address those risks in their statements. And unfortunately, yes, so far we're seeing some entities neglect to cover their operations.
Thanks, Ali. Nicholas, I might just direct this one to you. Are there any particular industries that would lend themselves to a collaborative approach?
But not really. I mean, I think any industry should collaborate is my very blunt response here. We've seen some very good traction now, obviously, with the Property Council of Australia. We've also set up a health fund insurance consortium. And recently, we've just started putting together a consortium in the utility space. So collaboration is definitely the way to go. I'd also even start getting people to think about even collaborating upstream and downstream within their own supply chain. So you might have some very large suppliers that work with you very closely. Collaborate with them as well and share some of the data, obviously within all the privacy laws as well. But that's another really good way of looking at it. If you're a very large organization with a very large supply chain, start collaborating with your major suppliers as well. And that will make things much more efficient for the entire sort of modern slavery movement, but also allow us to have a much bigger impact.
Great, thank you. Some great questions coming in. I'm going to direct another one to the Australian Border Force team. Why would you display non-complying statements before providing feedback to the reporting entity on why they don't comply?
Thanks, Sharon. So the aim of the Modern Slavery Act, as Ali said, is to promote increased supply chain transparency. And so our view is that we will display any statement that is provided to us by the board of a business that's been approved at that level and signed by a director. If that is a statement that that body chooses to sign off on, then under the Act, we have the discretion to publish that. And we think that that is important so that people who are using the register, whether they be civil society, investors, or business peers, see the full range of statements and see how businesses are responding. And I should say as well that there is a significant amount of support and assistance available for businesses, including through our team, and some very detailed online guidance that steps through the criteria. And so if businesses ensure that they follow those materials, then we wouldn't anticipate that there would be compliance issues with statements that they might submit.
Terrific, thank you. Chris Knight asks to the Border Force team, are you sufficiently resourced to be able to review and report back on all the MDS, and what are the consequences for non-compliance? Namaste.
Thanks, Sharon, and that's another good question. So we're very carefully and closely monitoring the quality of statements, and we've ensured that we're in a position to do that over the forthcoming reporting period. And obviously there will be times when there are higher rates of statements coming in, particularly as Ali said, around the deadlines for Australian financial year entities in March, calendar year entities in June. And so we're working to ensure that we're ready for those peaks, and that we continue to make sure that in our role we have a good sense of how statements are evolving and changing, and that's also, as Ellie said, why we'll be continuing to publish guidance and updates. In terms of compliance, the first reporting cycle will conclude for all entities at the end of June next year. And at that point, we'll be in a position to look at compliance trends across the full reporting cohort. And the Act, of course, does provide a power to the Minister to publicly identify entities that he considers have been non-compliant. And that's something that we'll be able to consider in more detail once we have that first tranche of reports for the full reporting cycle.
Great, thank you. And John Smith asks, outside of reviewing the statements, what future deep dives or audits will be planned, if any?
Sure. So we very much welcome feedback, and throughout the process of the Act, we've endeavoured to be very responsive to what business is telling us about areas where there might be challenges or need for further information. As Ali said, we're also in the process of finalising our Commonwealth statement, and so there's some learnings from that. So over the next year, one of our key areas of focus will be through forums like this and other engagement with businesses to take on feedback about where, as government, we can do more to support and equip businesses with information and tools to address modern slavery. And we're very open to suggestions and feedback from businesses if there are areas that you feel some further advice from government would be useful. So please do reach out to us if you're in that position.
Great, thanks, Alex.
Maybe could add something to that. So for instance, the Property Council of Australia, they're also now looking at auditing specific supplier responses as well. So that's one step in that direction as well, to validate and verify some of the supplier responses. And that's part of that transparency and visibility within the supply chains as well.
Great, thanks, Nicholas. Keep the Q&As coming, guys. Just a reminder to put it in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. And there's lots of them here. We'll keep going. Chris asks, will there be benchmarking performed after the first round that will set the bar moving forward?
Thanks, Sharon. So again, and this perhaps ties into the first question, our role as government is to facilitate transparency by publishing statements. So as part of that process, we don't intend to be identifying particular entities that have done well or done poorly. The role of the register is to ensure that anyone who's accessing the register can easily compare and contrast statements. Certainly in the UK, and we know that here in Australia, there's a number of organisations, whether they be in the investment sector or in civil society, who will be looking at statements with a view to conducting benchmarking exercises, and we expect that we'll certainly see those starting to come out from next year, but they won't be exercises and benchmarks that are coming out with a government endorsed result. And that won't be a process that we'll be directly engaging in. But as I said, as a result of the transparency, it's something that businesses should expect and anticipate. And that extra scrutiny we think is a good thing and very much in line with the objectives of the Act.
Thank you. Kerry asks, what about non-reporting entities deciding to implement a modern slavery statement as good practice?
So that's another important question. So of course, entities that aren't required to comply with the Act, as long as you're an Australian entity below the revenue threshold, you can opt in to prepare a voluntary statement. If you do formally opt in, then you are bound in the same way as an entity that's required to comply under the legislation. So we've worked to avoid a situation where an entity that provides a voluntary statement through our register can in some way have a different or a less substantive obligation than a mandated reporting entity. So entities that do voluntarily comply must comply to the same standard as a larger business. But we are also seeing some entities that, particularly in this first year, will prepare preliminary modern slavery statements that they might share with business partners or potentially on their website, but they won't formally submit those to Border Force. And again, it's important that those statements note that they're not formal statements available on the register, but that is a pathway for smaller entities who might be feeling their way around these requirements, working out what a modern slavery response looks like, and a way for them to start to explain and communicate that response without necessarily going through a formal compliance process.
Thank you. Nicholas, I might just direct one to you from Chris Knight. We have been working globally with Kevin Highland and several other entities globally. What are your thoughts on having an Australian modern day slavery commissioner?
Well, I might say something contentious here, but I would be totally in favor of that. Maybe some feedback from us if the government eventually decides also to sort of consider punitive measures for non-compliance. That would be another brilliant one. I'm not sure this was the spot for the plug for that, but that's something I think that a lot of our clients have been mentioning as well, that would provide additional incentives to the ones that might be kicking and screaming and saying, I don't really want to do this.
Thank you.
And maybe Alex, what are your thoughts on that? I don't want to put you on the spot, of course.
Perhaps we could just point out that the legislation is of course intended to be something that will evolve and change in line with the circumstances and the lessons that we learned from this first tranche of reporting. And there is a mandated three-year review of the legislation. So in 2022, the Parliament will be considering whether changes are needed, and it will be at Parliament's discretion what changes those might happen to be.
Thanks, Alex.
This is a good tactics question here from Carmel. What is the length of a higher quality statement?
Thanks, Carmel. So the Act doesn't set a minimum or a maximum or prescribe any length of a modern slavery statement. The only requirement is that it address the 7 mandatory criteria. So while longer is not always better, it's clear from the statements that we've seen so far that the shorter statements can struggle to really meaningfully address the 7 mandatory criteria. So we encourage entities developing their statements to recognise that their statements being published on the register will be read by diverse audiences, including investors, civil society, and other businesses. So it's important that you include sufficient context for each of these audiences in your statement. And the statements also need to be standalone documents. So while you can link to some external documents from your modern slavery statement, it's important that you include the key information, especially as they relate to the mandatory criteria within your statement, not just include a reference to your annual report to describe that information, which is something that we've been seeing in this first tranche of statements. So there's no hard and fast rule as to the length of a statement, but we have seen the shorter statements not really engaging meaningfully with the criteria.
Sure, thank you. Ashan asks, and I'll put this out to the whole group, what was the basis of choosing 100 million revenue as a requirement of reporting? How do we address modern slavery issues in entities that do not meet the criteria and yet fall in a high-risk procurement categories like cleaning services, security services, or any manpower-intensive industries? Who wants to go first?
With the Border Force, the government perspective on this, and the threshold was something that we focused on, particularly when we were developing the legislation. So there's a very extensive consultation process, and a key issue for us there was identifying a threshold that would cover the businesses that we understood it was important to cover, without placing an undue burden on smaller businesses that may not be equipped or have the capacity to do what the legislation is asking them to. And so particularly important here is the fact that the aim of this legislation is to drive change in global supply chains. And we know that global supply chains lead back to a relatively small proportion of very large businesses. And it's those businesses that have the influence, the leverage with suppliers, and also the capacity to do more than simply provide a piece of paper. They can drive real change, and they can affect that change quite quickly and across borders. And our view, when we were developing the legislation and when it was going through Parliament, was that those businesses are businesses that have over the $100 million in revenue. one of the issues that we'll be watching really closely over this first tranche of statements is how the quality of statements differs and changes between entities with different revenue levels. And as Ali said, it's perhaps significant that some of the early statements, a fairly large tranche of those 33, come from businesses with over 1 billion worth of annual revenue, and it's perhaps reflective of the fact that those businesses have been the more prepared and the more experienced, and have also had the capacity to do this more quickly. And we'll expect that those smaller entities closer to the 100 million level will be following along. Again, as I said as well, there's a 3-year review of the Act, so that will also be an issue that we consider in 3 years' time too.
Maybe just to add to that, I mean, whilst obviously the reporting entities have to be 100 million plus, obviously they have to report on their supply chains, and just by that sheer nature of it, they're going to engage with these smaller entities. Cleaning was mentioned in particular. A lot of cleaning organizations have been subject to a lot of the SAQ work that's been happening in these consortia, because it is one of the higher risk industries. So via that engagement between the buyer and the supplier, the smaller entities are beginning to sort of be more aware and also get resources via the larger organizations to pull them along on this journey as well. So smaller entities are being already touched by this as well, and that's a great thing, and it has to permeate over time into the different levels of the supply chains.
And it's important to echo what Nicholas said from our perspective. This is certainly something that we're seeing as smaller businesses within supply chains of reporting entities are starting to engage with this issue as the reporting requirement flows through. And again, that's something that's important and something that we want to make sure that the Act achieves is that while we may be regulating large entities, that the effects of the Act are flowing through supply chains in a way that's helpful, practical, and meaningful.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Nicholas. Sinead asks, is there an intention to require federal government departments to submit individual statements as has been introduced in the UK? She finds it concerning that the Department of Finance is doing one statement on behalf of all federal agency. This raises the risk of masking non-compliance.
Thanks for the question. So we are aware of the approach that the UK government has taken. For the government, when we were developing the Act, it became clear that there's a lot of work to do, and as the first Commonwealth statement that will be coming out in the coming weeks reflects, there was a lot of work to do across government in educating government agencies about how to develop or how to identify and assess modern slavery risks, and even at a baseline level what modern slavery is and what that might look like. Given that, we felt that a whole of government approach at the start was more appropriate, but as Alex has said earlier, there is a 3-year review of the Act, and that will be an issue that we consider at that point in time. And I also just wanted to flag the Department of Finance hasn't been leading the statement. Our team has actually been leading the statement. So while we've been working very closely with all government agencies, and we've had a very involved and in-depth consultation process across government, and particularly with some of the agencies that have higher risk, higher spend procurements for the government, to ensure that the Commonwealth statement reflects a whole government approach to where our key risks lie and what they might look like, and then ensure that our actions are consistent across government, which also helps our suppliers, so that there's a whole of government consistent approach to the way we engage with these risks and our suppliers.
Thanks, Ali. Tanya asks, how is the New South Wales Act harmonisation process going? Do we have an indication on when this may be finalised?
Thank you. So another really topical question, and so there's been a parliamentary inquiry into the New South Wales legislation and a government response which indicated that they will engage with the Commonwealth to consider harmonisation of the 2 reporting requirements. I can't comment on that any further than to say that's obviously been the approach that the New South Wales government has indicated that they will take, and I'm sure that both our jurisdiction and New South Wales will make sure that we keep businesses likely to be impacted by that discussion updated as we can.
Thank you. Vanessa asks, what are the most commonly seen risks and best approach to resolve them?
Do you want to go first, Nicholas?
That's a brilliant question. I mean, for everyone, it's very much in its infancy. So a lot of organizations are saying, look, I've got 30,000 suppliers. Where do I even start to look for my risks? And there's different kinds of resources like the Global Slavery Index. There's a social hotspot database. There's all these different tools that can help. What we've done in instance at Inform 365, we've developed what we call a screening tool where we screen suppliers based on the country of operations and the industry that they work in. And that provides then an initial snapshot of where the risks could potentially lie in your tier one supply chain. And that's how sort of we run it. So I'll give you an example. One of our clients, they have 30,000 suppliers. We pushed those suppliers through that risk filter and they came up with around 1,500 higher to very high risk suppliers. And that was a really good starting point for them to home in on where the potential risks are on the first tier of suppliers that they should engage with.
And if I could add to that, I think there's a very understandable reaction from businesses that are working through this for the first time to look for the list or the example that they can take and pick up and apply within their business. And that isn't necessarily the most helpful way to start, particularly in this first reporting cycle. And one of the things we have seen is that modern slavery risks will be really different for different businesses. Even you may be in the same sector, you may be a similar size to a business peer, but your supply chain risks may be materially different simply because of the way that you manage and engage with your suppliers. And so one of the things that's really important to do, often within a cross-functional working group within the business that brings together the different areas like legal and procurement and risk and HR, is to sit down and work through how for you as a business, modern slavery might be a risk in your operations and supply chains, and to go from there. And that can seem like an intimidating exercise and a large undertaking, but as Nicholas said earlier, it's not a situation of needing to arrive at perfection in year one. And it is really important that as businesses and as government, we consider our particular risk profiles and do that work within the business. And obviously there's some excellent resources available to help with that process.
Terrific. Thanks, Alex. Michael asks, I noticed that there is very little in the way of financial information included in statements. Is it a requirement? And if a requirement, what level of detail should be included? And Chris adds to this and says, good question, especially in regards to money laundering.
Sure. So there's a few things perhaps to unpack in that question. The first is that the Act sets criteria that businesses need to respond to, but it doesn't prescribe the content or the level of detail of those responses. And so every business will produce statements of differing length and differing complexity depending on their capacity, their resourcing and their commitment. In terms of including financial information, if you're not involved in the financial services sector, then financial information will be most relevant when you're describing your operations and your supply chains, particularly your procurement. And in that context, we really do encourage businesses to provide some context around the volume and the amount and the categories of their procurement where that's possible and feasible. And particularly that whatever information they provide, that they do so in a way that gives readers helpful context for the statement. So again, it's really important when you're drafting statements to recognize that there'll be a whole range of different audiences looking at that statement, whether it's civil society, investors, ourselves as government, or your business peers, and statements need to, and good statements should speak to those different audiences. And one of the ways to do that is to provide the context around financial information. If you're in the financial services sector, then obviously financial information becomes much more material and important because that's a key part of your operations, and there's perhaps a separate conversation about reporting on investments in that context. So the key message is, while there's not particular prescribed content, financial information can be really helpful context for the different audiences for your statement.
Great, thanks, Alex. Adam asks, is there any framework or guidelines on how to assess companies' policies and procedures? A lot of SAQs ask for documentation. How are these verified?
There's not a particular framework or piece of guidance from us on how to do that kind of assessment. What we're seeing is different businesses will have different views about the level of information that they're wanting from suppliers, and will approach that in different ways. And obviously groups like the Property Council have been doing some really important work in standardising that. So that's something that we're watching quite closely. And again, if there are ways that as government we can be helpful in that process, we're very happy to take that feedback on board, but there's nothing particular from us. But I suspect that Nicholas may have some more to add to that.
Yeah, at a practical level, things that we're looking at currently are things like robotic process automation, where we screen certain documents and look for keywords within those documents to make sure at least that a human rights policy does include key references to whatever that human rights policy wants to describe, and it's not just a picture of the dog or the cat or something like that. So that's one of the routes that we're looking at to sort of start validating the documents as well.
Thanks. Great questions coming through and loads. So we'll keep going. Jennifer asks, has any consideration been given to establishing an audit process whereby a company can voluntarily engage an appropriate body to audit, or where an audit might be imposed if they were suspicious of issues in an organisation or supply chain? This has effectively been answered, but also who would you see as appropriate partners to conduct such audits?
Perhaps I can just make the point that we have really seen with the Modern Slavery Act and with legislation elsewhere, the challenges and the benefits of social audits, and there is a great deal of guidance and literature and case studies about how those audits can be done well and how they can be done badly. And so while we're not identifying particular providers for those, it is really important that as a business, if you are looking to audits as a way to manage and assess your modern slavery risks, that you find a provider that you feel can do so appropriately and has the expertise to do that, and that you have regard to some of the challenges around audits as well, and recognise that a tick from an audit may not mean that a risk has been fully mitigated or remediated.
I absolutely concur with what Alex just said. There's different ways of doing it, and it's up to the client to basically decide this is what they're comfortable with, this is their commitment at this point in time, and that's going to evolve as well as this sector matures as well. So things are going to improve as well on that front as well.
Great. Ivan asks, can you advise on an approach to conduct due diligence on smaller suppliers who are not required to comply with the Modern Slavery Act? And what are some good examples that you've seen?
Well, that's sort of similar to the previous question. It is sort of the smaller suppliers do not have to report, obviously, but they'll be engaged via organizations potentially that have to report. So they will be exposed to SAQs, self-assessment questionnaires, where they provide details as to where they currently sit in the process. So that's what happens there. I mean, a smaller entity, unless they're a voluntary, they provide a voluntary statement, they do not have to take action on that, but they will over time naturally become engaged with larger buyers when they're asked to complete SAQs or self-assessment questionnaires.
Thank you. Next question from Chris. Do Australian Border Force foresee implementing strict importation measures as has Canada, i.e. stopping goods at the port if found to have a form of modern slavery in the supply chain?
So the main country that's currently using importation measures as a means to address modern slavery is the United States, and their US Customs and Border Protection Service has the ability to issue what's called withhold release orders against a particular importation of goods made in a specified factory or facility. The United States, of course, and Canada, which is implementing a similar approach, don't have modern slavery transparency legislation in the way that Australia has. So that's the particular approach that the US has adopted is to focus on imports. It's something that we're watching very closely, but it's not something that we intend to follow at this point in time. And again, I think it's pertinent to note that there is the 3-year review of the legislation, and at that time, there will of course be some consideration from us around those other legislative approaches that countries have taken and how they may be working vis-a-vis our legislation.
Thanks. Interesting question from Stuart. Is the increasing use of underpaid interns, and I'd say volunteers as well, within corporate Australia, often with deceptive promises of future employment, part of the scope of this legislation? Really interesting question.
So not on its face, no. So when we're talking about modern slavery, we're talking about very extreme and egregious exploitation, and generally the use of interns and the pay arrangements around that wouldn't fall into that category.
Thank you. Amanda asks, will the Australian Border Force continue publishing guidance tools templates to assist entities to work with their suppliers to uplift their modern slavery controls, e.g. as part of their contract management, supplier relationship management processes?
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for the question. We'll definitely continue to publish guidance and various tools and templates, especially as we're advised by the business community and industry as to what's helpful for government to provide guidance on. In the public procurement space, we've recently published a toolkit of modern slavery resources, which includes some tools and templates to address modern slavery risks throughout the life cycle of procurement. And most perhaps importantly for the people here today, that included some model modern slavery contract clauses, which have graduating obligations that you can select from depending on the particular risk profile of that particular procurement and that supplier. And they're meant to be adapted. They're just model clauses, but they provide some guidance for not just government, but for other procurement contexts. And we will be looking particularly over the next 12 months, a big focus in the Commonwealth space will be to provide some guidance for government agencies, but again, will be equally applicable outside the government context around supplier engagement. And we're looking at drafting some model modern slavery tender clauses and things like that. So keep an eye on the Modern Slavery Register, and we'll keep uploading various resources onto that. But we also welcome any feedback or advice from industry and business about what might be most helpful for us to focus on initially.
Thanks, Ellie. Richard asks, is it okay to go only to tier 1 level on the first statement, even if you have high risk activity in your supply chain, e.g. distributor in Australia, but manufacturer in China?
Thanks, Richard. The key principle I think to keep in mind here is something Nicholas alluded to in his presentation, which is the idea of continuous improvement. So is it okay if after 4 or 5 years of reporting, you haven't gone beyond tier 1 in your supply chain? I think most people reading your statement would say no. But in your first year, as you're building your response, particularly as a business, if this is the first time that you've considered modern slavery issues, then practically it's likely you won't be able to go beyond tier 1 in your first year. And what's important in your statement there is to make sure that you do indicate an intent and perhaps a general plan of how you intend to go further in future years. So that continuous improvement is really important. And while you don't want to stop at tier 1, we certainly recognize and appreciate that there will be many entities in that situation in the first reporting cycle.
Just to underpin what Alex just said, what we're seeing practically is a lot of our clients are focusing on their tier 1 in their year 1 statement. But as Alex rightfully said, that's not where you can stop. You can't just hide behind your tier 1s and say, whatever happens beyond that is none of my business. It is that continuous improvement aspect that will drive you, or has to drive you, to the next tiers.
Thanks, Nicholas. Ivan asks if the entity in Australia also has entities globally, including the UK, what is the expected minimum coverage of the Australian entity's modern slavery plan and statement?
Thanks, Ivan. So this can be a complex question depending on where the Australian entity sits in the group. So I'll answer it quickly with two responses. The first is situations where you have a global parent that has an Australian subsidiary. The Australian subsidiary is the reporting entity, and the global parent is preparing a statement that it might submit in a number of jurisdictions, including Australia. In that situation, it's really important that the statement identifies the subsidiary that is the Australian reporting entity, and that it does talk about that subsidiary's operations and its supply chains and its risks. In some cases, if that subsidiary is sharing the same policies and processes and involved in the same sector as the global parent, then you can consolidate all that information in together. The second scenario is where you have an Australian reporting entity that owns subsidiaries overseas. In that case, the Act requires the Australian reporting entity to describe risks in its operations and supply chains as well as its subsidiaries. You may take the view that your subsidiaries have particular risks that you think should be identified in the statement. Alternatively, it may be the case that you don't feel your subsidiaries have significant risks and you focus on the risks within the reporting entity itself. But you do need to ensure that you're considering those risks and that you're describing the activities of those subsidiaries wherever they are in the world in your statement.
Josephine asks, if we are having issues understanding the Act and we have general inquiries that require clarification, is there any government platform available where we could send our questions?
Thanks, Josephine. Certainly, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's quite a comprehensive guidance document available on our website and on the Modern Slavery Register. And if you read through that and find you still need some further guidance or clarification, our team is available to provide that. You can just email our inbox, I think, which is on the website, it points you to our inbox, but it's slavery.consultations@abf.gov.au.
Thank you. Anonymous, what are the expectations from Border Force regarding those suppliers who don't respond to the questionnaire the RE requests to be completed?
So I'll take this question as just relating to general questionnaires that a business might be providing to its suppliers. In that case, it's very much a decision for the business. How you respond, the Act doesn't require a particular approach. And what we do say to businesses is to be, particularly in this first reporting period, conscious of the position your suppliers are in. They may have a large number of questionnaires that they're responding to, that you don't immediately look to end a supplier relationship on the basis of a response such as this, but that you attempt to engage and engage with that supplier to address the issues that you might be concerned about. And it may be that there are practical things that you can do as the customer to manage that relationship.
Thanks, Alex. So many good questions have come through, and in the interest of time, we can't get through to them all, but we will arrange for these questions to be answered and sent through back to the people who have asked them. So thank you so much for asking so many great questions. I just want to finish with some closing comments from our panelists. And Nicholas, perhaps we'll start with you with some closing comments.
I'll be short and sharp. In this space, we want to exterminate modern slavery. Collaborate as much as you can within your industry peers, upstream, downstream. Just collaborate. It makes life easier, and we get quicker, more consistent transparency.
Terrific. Alex, Ali?
I'll be very quick and brief as well. I just wanted to say that the publication of this first tranche of statements, in the word of our Minister, marks a new era of transparency, and it's an exciting moment for businesses. And I just want to reiterate as well that our team is available to help if you have any queries, and the guidance document should be able to answer most of your questions, but if not, our team is always here to provide some further information.
Thank you. Alex?
I echo Ali's thoughts.
Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you to Ali and to Alex and the Australian Border Force team. Very much appreciate being here today and the work that you do. And Nicholas and Inform 365, thank you for your partnership and for the advocacy that you also do. Just to wrap up, finally, is just today, colleagues Nolan Monarch-Masson and Jane O'Toole and many colleagues across the globe have made a global call out to our procurement professionals to prioritise the eradication of modern slavery in 2021. So they're saying, as a procurement community, we need to reflect on our strategic priorities and move modern slavery to the front of our agenda, helping governments and suppliers eradicate this problem. So join that movement and lead the way, my procurement professionals. Please join us and register by visiting the events page on the website and also via LinkedIn to all our attendees. I know that you found this as insightful as I found it, and we will get back to those unanswered questions. But before you leave today, please, could I ask you to do the post-event webinar or the post-webinar survey? We need your feedback to make these better than ever. A copy of the webinar and any unanswered questions will be emailed to you next week. Best wishes for the festive season, and we look forward to working with you in 2021 as we move the profession forward and also move the agenda of eradicating modern slavery. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.